Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're standing in the pre-dawn darkness of the Egyptian desert, circa 3100 BCE. The air is cool, sharp against your skin. Behind you, the Nile flows like liquid obsidian, its ancient waters whispering secrets older than human memory. Before you rises a temple constructed from massive limestone blocks that seem to defy the primitive tools of this age. Torches flicker inside, casting dancing shadows across walls covered in symbols. Hieroglyphs that shouldn't exist yet, depicting scenes that make no logical sense. And there, in the inner sanctum, you witness something that will echo through 30 centuries of human history: the coronation of the first god-king. But as the priests place the double crown upon his head, white and red, Upper and Lower Egypt united for the first time, a question burns in the torchlit air like incense smoke. Who decided this man should rule? What power ordained that he was not merely human, but divine? And why do the inscriptions insist he is Horus incarnate? A living god whose right to rule was granted not by men, but by beings who descended from the heavens themselves. Tonight, we're going to investigate one of history's most explosive mysteries. What if the first pharaohs of Egypt, those god-kings who united the two lands and built a civilization that would dominate the ancient world for 3,000 years, were not chosen through conquest, politics, or even divine right as we understand it, but were selected, bred, and installed by the Anunnaki? Those powerful entities the ancient Sumerians described in the world's oldest texts as coming from the sky, bringing forbidden knowledge, establishing kingship, and literally creating the bloodlines that would rule humanity. This isn't just ancient history. This is a forensic investigation spanning 5 millennia and 2 of the most sophisticated civilizations ever to emerge in the ancient world. Where clay tablets become crime scene evidence, where hieroglyphs are witness statements, where mainstream archaeology and suppressed truths collide in spectacular fashion, and where the line between gods and kings, between myth and genetic reality, between the earthly and the extraterrestrial becomes impossibly, disturbingly blurred. Before we descend into this rabbit hole, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know how global this truth-seeking community really is. And subscribe, because what we're about to uncover will change how you see not just ancient history, but human origins themselves. The visuals you're seeing are here to enhance the experience, but they're not necessary to follow along. You can listen to this entire investigation while you work, drive, or drift off into contemplation. Now, let's begin where the evidence demands we begin. Not in Egypt, but in Mesopotamia, in the land between 2 rivers, where the Anunnaki first made contact with humanity. To understand whether the Anunnaki chose Egypt's first pharaohs, we first need to understand exactly who or what the Anunnaki were. And I need to be straight with you from the start. What I'm about to tell you will be dismissed by mainstream academics. They'll call it pseudoscience, fringe theory, dangerous misinformation. But here's what they won't tell you. The Anunnaki are not some internet conspiracy theory. They are documented extensively in the oldest written texts humanity possesses. The name Anunnaki appears throughout Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets dating back to 2100 BCE, over 4,000 years ago. These aren't vague mythological references. These are detailed, specific, technical descriptions of beings who came from the sky, who possessed advanced knowledge, who created human civilization, and who established kingship itself as a divine institution. The mainstream translation of Anunnaki is typically given as princely offspring or those of royal blood, suggesting they were the children of Anu, the supreme sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. In the official academic narrative, the Anunnaki were simply the major deities of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian pantheons. The important gods, the ones who held power, made decisions in divine councils, decreed the fates of mortals and lesser gods. Among their number were some of the most significant figures in ancient religion. Enlil, the god of air and storms, often considered the executive authority of the entire pantheon. the commander, the enforcer. Enki, also known as Ea, the god of wisdom, fresh water, magic, and creation. The scientist, the genetic engineer, the one who, according to the texts, created humanity itself. Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with fertility and the earth, the one whose womb was used to gestate the first humans. Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, who would later rise to become chief of all the gods. Now, if you've been taught standard world mythology, you'd think these were just gods, spiritual beings worshipped by ancient people who didn't understand natural phenomena. Thunder was the anger of the gods. Floods were divine punishment. Harvests depended on proper sacrifices. Neat, simple, safe. But the texts themselves tell a very different story. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest Mesopotamian creation accounts, describes something that sounds nothing like primitive religious mythology and everything like a labor dispute among a technologically advanced species. According to the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki faced a problem. The junior gods, called the Igigi, had been forced to do all the hard work of terraforming and maintaining Earth. They dug rivers. They built irrigation canals. They toiled in backbreaking labor for thousands of years. And eventually they revolted. They burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's house, refusing to work another day. The solution: create a new species, primitive worker, humanity. The god Enki proposed they fashion a being using clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god. The mother goddess Ninhursag would gestate these new creatures in her womb. The result was Homo sapiens, a hybrid species, genetically engineered to serve as a labor force for the Anunnaki. We were not created as beloved children of the gods. According to these texts, we were created as slaves. Our purpose was to work the fields, maintain the temples, mine the gold, and provide the resources the Anunnaki needed. Now, mainstream scholars read this as mythology, a just-so story explaining why humans must work hard to survive. They point out that many ancient cultures have creation myths involving gods making humans from clay or earth. It's a universal motif. But in 1976, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that would change how millions of people understood these stories forever. His book was called The 12th Planet, and it proposed something extraordinary. These texts are not mythology. They are mistranslated history. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not gods in any spiritual sense, but physical beings, extraterrestrials, advanced visitors from another planet in our own solar system. A massive planet called Nibiru, which orbits the sun on a vast elliptical path taking 3,600 years to complete. According to Sitchin's translation and interpretation of the Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago seeking gold, which they needed to repair their planet's failing atmosphere. When their workers revolted, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of primitive hominids already evolving on Earth. We are, in Sitchin's view, a hybrid species, part terrestrial ape, part extraterrestrial god, created explicitly to be slaves in the gold mines of the Anunnaki. Sitchin spent decades developing this theory. He identified specific Anunnaki leaders, Enki as the benevolent scientist who championed humanity and gave us forbidden knowledge, and Enlil as the stern military commander who often wanted us destroyed. He traced their influence through the Great Flood, through the building of the first cities, through the establishment of kingship, and critically, through their operations across the ancient world, including Egypt. Now, I need to address the elephant in the room head-on. Sitchin's theories are overwhelmingly rejected by mainstream academia. Not just rejected, thoroughly dismantled by experts in ancient languages. Scholars who can actually read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform have repeatedly pointed out that Sitchin's translations are often inaccurate, that he frequently quotes out of context, assigns meanings to words that don't match ancient dictionaries, and constructs interpretations that simply aren't supported by the texts. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar with credentials in Hebrew and ancient Semitic languages, dedicated significant effort to documenting Sitchin's errors. He points out that Anunnaki does not mean those who from heaven came, as Sitchin claimed, but rather princely seed or royal offspring. He demonstrates that there is no cuneiform text anywhere that mentions a 12th planet or describes the Anunnaki as space travelers. Ronald Fritz, in his book Invented Knowledge, writes that Sitchin's methodology is fundamentally flawed. He selectively presents evidence, ignores contradictory data, and manufactures connections the ancient texts simply do not make. So why am I telling you all this if Sitchin has been debunked? Because despite the academic condemnation, his ideas have achieved something remarkable. They've captured the imagination of millions. His books have been translated into more than 25 languages. His theories form the backbone of the ancient astronaut hypothesis that dominates shows like Ancient Aliens. And most importantly for our investigation tonight, his work forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what the ancient texts actually say. Questions that mainstream academia often dismisses without fully addressing. When the Atrahasis describes humans being created from clay mixed with the essence of a god, when it specifies that the mother goddess gestated the first humans in her womb like surrogate mothers, when it provides technical details about a creation process that sounds more like genetic engineering than divine magic, we have to ask, are we reading pure metaphor? Or is there something more here? Something the ancient scribes were trying to describe but lacked the vocabulary to explain? The truth, as always, lies in nuanced middle ground. The Anunnaki were almost certainly the gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, divine beings as understood within their religious framework. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss every strange detail in these texts as primitive superstition. Ancient peoples were not stupid. They observed their world carefully. They recorded what they saw. If those records contain persistent anomalies, strange details that don't fit neat mythological boxes, then those anomalies deserve investigation. Not blind belief, but honest, rigorous investigation. And one of the most persistent anomalies in ancient history is the sudden, explosive emergence of pharaonic Egypt and its bizarre insistence that its kings were not merely human, but gods incarnate, chosen by forces beyond the mortal realm. Which brings us to the Nile, to approximately 3100 BCE, to a man named Narmer, and to the moment when everything changed. Let us leave the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and journey west, following the ancient trade routes across deserts and along the Mediterranean coast, to the banks of the Nile, to a moment around 3100 BCE when something unprecedented in human history occurred. Before this moment, Egypt was divided, two separate kingdoms with different crowns, different patron deities, different identities. Upper Egypt in the south, with its capital at Hierakonpolis, was more urbanized, more warlike, home to powerful city-states competing for dominance. The white crown, the Hedjit, symbolized their authority. Lower Egypt in the north, spreading across the fertile Nile Delta, was wealthier in grain and fish but less politically unified. The red crown, the Dishret, represented the Delta lands. These two kingdoms had been separate for as long as anyone could remember. Centuries, perhaps millennia. They had different cultures, different traditions, different gods. And then, in one of the most pivotal moments in human civilization, a man whose name we know as Narmer, also called Menes in later traditions, united them. Through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriage, and something else we'll explore, he merged Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. He established the first dynasty. He founded a new capital called Memphis at the strategic junction where the two lands met. And he became the first true pharaoh, the first god-king of a unified Egypt. The Narmer Palette, one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Egypt, commemorates this unification. It's a ceremonial shield-shaped object, about 2 feet tall, carved from gray-green siltstone. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. The symbolism is unmistakable. He is both. He has united the two lands. But there's something else on this palette that should make us pause. Something that changes everything. Hovering above Narmer's head is a falcon, the symbol of the god Horus. This is not decorative. This is not metaphorical background art. The placement and context make a clear, unambiguous statement. Narmer is Horus. The god has taken human form. The divine has become flesh. From this moment forward, every pharaoh of Egypt would carry the Horus name as the first and most important element of their royal identity. They were not kings who worshipped Horus. They were not men blessed by Horus. They were Horus. This concept of divine kingship became the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was not a man elected by the people, not a warrior who seized power through military might, not even a noble chosen by priests. He was the living incarnation of the gods. In life, he was Horus, the sky god, the falcon who soared above Egypt, protecting and guiding his people. In death, he became Osiris, king of the underworld, and his son ascended the throne as the new Horus. This was not symbolic. This was not metaphorical. To the ancient Egyptians, this was literal truth. The pharaoh's blood was divine. His body was a temple. His words were law because they were the words of a god. Now, here's the question that has puzzled Egyptologists for over a century. The question they acknowledge but can never satisfactorily answer. Where did this concept come from? Why did the first pharaohs establish themselves not as powerful men, not as warriors blessed by the gods, but as gods themselves? Divine kingship was not inevitable. Most ancient kingdoms didn't work this way. In Mesopotamia, kings remained subordinate to the gods. They were chosen by the gods, favored by the gods, but they were not the gods themselves. Even when kings like Naram-Sin of Akkad declared themselves divine, it was controversial and didn't last. But in Egypt, divine kingship was foundational, immediate, and it endured for 3,000 years. Mainstream Egyptology explains this as an indigenous development, a natural evolution of Egyptian religious thought combined with political necessity. When Narmer unified the two lands, he needed a claim to legitimacy that transcended regional loyalty. By declaring himself the living Horus, he positioned himself above the squabbles of Upper and Lower Egypt. He was neither. He was both. He was divine. This explanation is logical, well-reasoned, completely plausible, but it doesn't address the timing. It doesn't explain why this concept appeared so suddenly, so completely formed. It doesn't explain why Egyptian artistic conventions, the way pharaohs were depicted, the symbolism used, the entire visual language, appeared fully developed at the very beginning and remained essentially unchanged for 3 millennia. And it certainly doesn't address the strange, undeniable connections between Egypt and Mesopotamia that emerged precisely at this moment in history. Because here's what makes this mystery genuinely compelling. Right around 3100 BCE, at the exact moment Narmer was unifying Egypt and establishing divine kingship, there was intense, documented cultural exchange between Egypt and Mesopotamia. This is not speculation. This is not fringe theory. This is established archaeological fact. During what's called the Naqada II and Naqada III periods, roughly 3600 to 3000 BCE, we see unmistakable Mesopotamian influence flooding into Egypt. Cylinder seals, a Mesopotamian invention, suddenly appear in Egyptian tombs. Distinctive Mesopotamian artistic motifs, like interlocking serpent-necked animals, show up in Egyptian art. Mesopotamian architectural concepts, particularly raised platform temples, seem to influence early Egyptian monumental architecture. The concept of writing itself may have been transmitted from Mesopotamia to Egypt during this period. The Egyptians didn't copy Sumerian cuneiform, they developed their own hieroglyphic system. But the idea, the concept that symbols could represent sounds and preserve speech, appears in both civilizations at almost the same moment. This wasn't casual contact. This was sustained, intensive cultural exchange. Trade networks connected Mesopotamia and Egypt through intermediaries in the Levant. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan reached Egypt through Mesopotamian trade routes. Pottery styles from Uruk appear in Egyptian contexts. Wine jars showing Mesopotamian influence have been found at Abydos. Ideas were flowing. Technologies were being shared. Knowledge was being transmitted. And right at the peak of this exchange, divine kingship appears in Egypt, fully formed, as if someone brought not just goods and technologies, but a complete political theology, a template for how to organize a state with a god-king at its head. This is where the Anunnaki hypothesis becomes genuinely interesting. Not because we have proof that ancient aliens flew to Egypt, we don't, but because the pattern is undeniable. Mesopotamia develops complex civilization first. Urban centers, writing, monumental architecture, the concept of kingship as a divine institution. All of this emerges in Sumer between 4000 and 3000 BCE. And according to the ancient texts themselves, the Sumerians attributed these advancements not to their own invention, but to gifts from the Anunnaki, the gods who came from the sky and taught humanity how to build, how to write, how to organize society. Then Egypt explodes onto the historical scene around 3100 BCE with all these same elements, but refined, perfected, made even more magnificent. And just like the Sumerians, the Egyptians insist that their kings are not merely human, that they are chosen by, descended from, the embodiment of divine beings. Is it possible that the same external influence that shaped Mesopotamian civilization also shaped Egyptian civilization? That the Anunnaki, whether we understand them as extraterrestrials, as survivors of an advanced pre-flood civilization, or as something else entirely, operated in both regions? That they didn't just advise and teach, but actively selected and perhaps even bred the first royal bloodlines of both civilizations? Let me show you the evidence. Piece by piece, anomaly by anomaly, let's examine what we know for certain about those first Egyptian pharaohs and their claims to divine descent. The figure of Narmer emerges from history more like a legend than a man, and that itself is significant. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing over 2,000 years after Narmer lived, recorded stories about Menes as the first king of Egypt. Egyptian king lists from the New Kingdom, like the Abydos king list carved into the Temple of Seti I, place Menes at the very beginning, the first name in a line of pharaohs stretching back before recorded history. But here's where it gets strange. The archaeological record gives us abundant evidence of a king named Narmer. His name appears on the famous palette, on cylinder seals, on pottery at sites across Egypt and even in Canaan. We have his tomb at Abydos, one of the earliest royal burials. We have inscriptions showing his military campaigns. But for Menes, the legendary first pharaoh of the king lists, we have almost nothing contemporary. No tomb clearly identified as his. No definitive inscriptions from his lifetime. The most widely accepted solution, proposed by the renowned Egyptologist Flinders Petrie in the early 20th century, is that Narmer and Menes were the same person. Narmer was his birth name, his Horus name. Menes was a title, an honorific meaning he who endures, given to commemorate his achievement in unifying Egypt. This makes sense. It resolves the contradiction, but it also reveals something fascinating about how we remember and mythologize the past. By the time Egyptian scribes of the New Kingdom were carving their king lists, Narmer had become Menes. The real man, with his complex life, his political struggles, his probably controversial reign, had been transformed into a perfect archetypal figure. The first pharaoh, the unifier, the founder not just of a dynasty, but of a cosmic order. He had become more than human in memory, even as he likely claimed to be more than human in life. So what do we actually know about this pivotal figure? We know that before Narmer, there were proto-kingdoms in both Upper and Lower Egypt. We have evidence of rulers from what's called Dynasty Zero, kings like Ka and Scorpion who controlled parts of Upper Egypt. These were powerful men, but they were not pharaohs. They had not achieved unification. They had not claimed to be gods incarnate. Narmer changed everything. The evidence suggests his conquest of Lower Egypt was relatively swift and probably involved strategic marriage as much as military might. He married Nithotep, a princess from Nakata in Lower Egypt, a union that likely secured the loyalty of that crucial region. His tomb and hers are found together at the ancient cemetery near Abydos, suggesting this was more than just a political arrangement. It was a dynasty-founding partnership. But it's the symbolic aspects of Narmer's reign that concern us most. The Narmer Palette doesn't just commemorate military victory. It establishes a complete theological statement about kingship. Let me walk you through it because the details matter. On what's considered the front of the palette, Narmer is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. He holds a mace raised high above his head, about to strike a kneeling prisoner whose hair he grips in his other hand. Behind Narmer walks a servant carrying his sandals, indicating that Narmer's feet are too holy to touch common ground. The prisoner appears to be a chief or king from Lower Egypt, based on the hieroglyphs near his head. This is the moment of conquest, the moment when Upper Egypt defeats Lower Egypt. But look above the prisoner. There, carved in exquisite detail, is one of the most extraordinary images on the entire palette. A falcon Horus perches on top of papyrus plants sprouting from marshland, papyrus being the symbol of Lower Egypt. And in the falcon's talons, gripped by a rope, is a human head emerging from the papyrus. The symbolism here is layered and profound. The falcon is Horus, but the falcon is also Narmer. They are one and the same. The falcon has captured an enemy and is presenting this captive to Narmer, or perhaps Horus is Narmer, and the image shows the king in his divine form subduing the papyrus land, Lower Egypt, bringing it under his control. This is not metaphor. This is not artistic flourish. This is a theological declaration. Narmer conquers not through his own power alone, but because he is the god Horus in human flesh. On the reverse side of the palette, Narmer is shown again, but now he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, the Dishret. This is the earliest known example of a single ruler wearing both crowns. The message is revolutionary. Narmer is not king of Upper Egypt or king of Lower Egypt. He is king of both. He is the unifier. Before him march standard-bearers carrying poles topped with symbols of various gods and royal power. They lead a procession toward 10 decapitated corpses laid out in rows. These bodies are shown with their heads placed between their feet, a shocking image deliberately designed to demonstrate the absolute and terrible power of the king over his enemies. Above these corpses are hieroglyphic symbols, including a ship, a falcon, and other markers, likely representing the names of conquered towns or regions. A literal list of Narmer's victories, carved in stone for eternity. At the center of this side, we see one of the palette's most mysterious elements. 2 serpopards, fantastical creatures that are part serpent, part leopard, face each other with their long necks intertwined, forming a circle. These serpopards don't appear anywhere else in Egyptian art. They seem to be imported directly from Mesopotamian artistic traditions, where similar long-necked beasts are common motifs. This is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for Mesopotamian influence on early Egyptian art, and it appears on the single most important artifact commemorating the founding of the Egyptian state. Think about that. Many scholars believe the intertwined necks represent the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, 2 separate powers brought together, their strength combined into one unified force. At the bottom of the palette, Narmer appears one final time, but now he's not shown as a man. He's depicted as a bull, a massive, powerful animal with great curved horns, trampling a fallen enemy and breaking through the walls of a fortified city. The bull was one of the most potent symbols of royal power in ancient Egypt, representing the pharaoh's physical strength, his virility, his ability to destroy his enemies through sheer force. By showing Narmer as a bull, the palette makes a clear statement. The king is not just a man who commands armies. He is a force of nature, an unstoppable power. When we step back and look at the Narmer palette as a whole, what emerges is not just a record of military conquest, but a complete theological statement about the nature of kingship. Narmer is shown as a man, but also as Horus the falcon, and as a bull he wears the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt. He conquers enemies not just through his own strength, but with the active participation of Horus himself. He is so sacred that his feet cannot touch common ground. The palette establishes several concepts that would define Egyptian kingship for 3,000 years. First, The king is divine. He is not just chosen by the gods, he is a god, Horus in human form. Second, the king is the unifier and protector of Marat, cosmic order. Without him, Upper and Lower Egypt would fall into chaos. Third, the king's power is absolute and terrifying. Those who oppose him face not just military defeat, but total annihilation. But here's what makes the Narmer Palette truly extraordinary from our investigation's perspective. This complete theology of divine kingship appears fully formed. There's no visible evolution here, no gradual development. The artistic conventions used on the palette, the hierarchical scale showing the king larger than everyone else, the use of registers to organize scenes, the twisted perspective of the human figure, all of this becomes standard in Egyptian art for the next 3 millennia. But it appears here at the very beginning already perfected. It's as if someone handed the Egyptians a template, a complete instruction manual for how to represent royal power, and they simply followed it for the next 3,000 years. Similarly, the hieroglyphic writing on the palette is primitive, yes, but it's already functional. It already works as a writing system. The symbols can be read. They convey meaning. They spell out names and possibly describe actions. Writing doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It takes time to develop, to standardize, to become useful. Yet here it is, at the dawn of the first dynasty, already capable of recording the name of the king and describing his achievements. Compare this to Mesopotamia, where we can actually trace the evolution of writing over centuries, from simple pictographs to more complex cuneiform. We see the development. We see the mistakes. We see the gradual refinement. In Egypt, it appears almost overnight. The mainstream explanation is that these developments happened during the late pre-dynastic period, in the centuries leading up to Narmer's reign. That the conventions we see on the palette were worked out through trial and error on earlier, now-lost works. This is probably true, but it doesn't explain the perfection, the confidence, the complete systematic nature of what we see here. And it doesn't explain why these conventions, once established, never changed. Egyptian art in the time of Ramesses II, over 1,500 years after Narmer, looks essentially identical to the art on the Narmer palette. That kind of stylistic stability is unprecedented in human art history. Most artistic traditions evolve, change, respond to new influences. But Egyptian art remained essentially frozen for 3 millennia, as if the original template was so perfect, so divinely ordained, that any deviation would be sacrilege. This brings us to a genuinely uncomfortable question. If the first pharaohs really were chosen, bred, or installed by the Anunnaki, if they really were hybrids or descendants of non-human entities, what would we expect to see in the archaeological record? We would expect exactly what we see. A sudden flowering of sophisticated civilization, fully developed artistic and architectural conventions appearing at the very beginning with no clear evolutionary pathway system of divine kingship that makes extraordinary claims and maintains those claims with absolute consistency for thousands of years. Clear evidence of cultural exchange with Mesopotamia, where similar claims about divine kingship were already well established. The Narmer Palette doesn't prove the ancient astronaut hypothesis, but it certainly doesn't disprove it either. It stands as a monument to a transformation so profound, so complete, that even after 5,000 years, we struggle to fully comprehend what happened at the dawn of dynastic Egypt. But we're just getting started, because after Narmer came a line of pharaohs, each one claiming the same divine heritage. And the dynasty they founded would face a crisis so severe it nearly destroyed divine kingship itself. A theological civil war that might reveal the truth about competing Anunnaki bloodlines. The first dynasty of Egypt, spanning roughly from 3100 to 2890 BCE, was a period of explosive, almost unnatural development. Within just a few generations, we're talking perhaps 200 years, Egypt went from a collection of competing settlements to a highly organized state with a sophisticated bureaucracy, monumental architecture, a fully developed writing system, a complex religious hierarchy, all centered on the god-king pharaoh. This kind of rapid development is not impossible, but it is unusual. It suggests either that the Egyptians were preternaturally brilliant, that they were building on foundations laid by others whose works have been lost, or that they had help, guidance, templates, genetic programming from an outside source. After Narmer came Hora-Ha, whose name means fighting hawk. Many scholars believe this is Narmer's son, though others argue Hora-Ha might be identical to Menes. The identification of these early kings is genuinely confusing because they used multiple names, and later traditions conflated figures who may have been separate. Hora-Ha's tomb at Abydos is significantly larger and more elaborate than Narmer's, suggesting the dynasty was consolidating power and wealth rapidly. He appears to have conducted military campaigns into Nubia to the south and Libya to the west, expanding Egypt's territory and securing trade routes. After Hora-Ha came a succession of pharaohs: Jur, Jet, Den, Anagib, Semerket, Qaa. Names we know primarily from inscriptions on stone and pottery. Each tomb at Abydos is larger than the last. Each shows increasing sophistication in construction and increasing wealth in grave goods. By the reign of Den, around 2900 BCE, we see remarkable innovations. The first recorded use of stone flooring in a tomb stairs descending to the burial chamber, the pharaoh wearing the sikamti, the double crown that combined the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt into a single symbol of unified rule. But perhaps the most interesting figure from the first dynasty is a woman, Mernith. She was likely the wife of King Jet and the mother of King Denver. When Jet died and Den was too young to rule, Mernith served as regent. Her tomb at Abydos is the same size and style as the tombs of the kings, suggesting she held power equal to a pharaoh. Some Egyptologists argue she should be counted as Egypt's first female pharaoh, ruling in her own right before her son came of age. What's fascinating about Mernith is that her very existence challenges our assumptions about early Egyptian society. This wasn't a primitive patriarchal culture where women were property. This was a sophisticated civilization that understood power could be inherited through maternal lines, that divine blood could flow through women as easily as men. If the pharaohs were truly descendants of divine beings, of the Anunnaki, then the bloodline was what mattered, not the gender of its carrier. This becomes critically important when we reach the Second Dynasty, because what happened there nearly destroyed everything. The Second Dynasty, roughly 2890 to 2686 BCE, saw something unprecedented and deeply strange. A crisis so severe it nearly destroyed the concept of divine kingship and the unity of Egypt itself. Around 2740 BCE, a pharaoh named Peribsen did something shocking, something that should have been unthinkable. He removed the Horus falcon from his serek, the rectangular palace facade that enclosed the pharaoh's name, and replaced it with the symbol of Set, not Horus, Set, Set, the god of chaos, storms, violence, and the desert. Set, Horus's eternal enemy, the murderer of Osiris, the embodiment of disorder. For a pharaoh to identify himself with Set rather than Horus was theological revolution. It suggested that Egypt was fracturing, that Upper and Lower Egypt were pulling apart again, or there was a fundamental dispute about which gods should be supreme, or something even more disturbing, that different divine bloodlines were competing for control. We don't know exactly what happened during Peribsen's reign, but we know it must have been catastrophic. To understand why, we need to examine the foundational myth of Egyptian kingship, the story of Horus and Set. Osiris, the first king of Egypt, was murdered by his brother Set, who tore Osiris's body apart and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, gathered the pieces and resurrected Osiris long enough to conceive a son, Horus. That son grew up in hiding in the marshes of the Delta, protected from Set's wrath, until he was strong enough to challenge Set for the throne. The battle between Horus and Set was epic, spanning years, involving multiple contests and trials before the Divine Council. They fought as hippopotami in the Nile. They engaged in sailing contests and tests of strength. Set blinded Horus in one eye, creating the famous Eye of Horus symbol. But Horus eventually prevailed. The gods judged him the rightful king, and Osiris's throne was restored to its legitimate heir. This myth wasn't just a story the Egyptians told. It was the charter myth of their entire political system. Every pharaoh was Horus, the rightful king. Every pharaoh claimed descent from Osiris through an unbroken line of succession. Set represented everything the pharaoh was not: the illegitimate usurper, the bringer of chaos, the enemy of Ma'at. So when Peripson placed the Set animal atop his Serek instead of the Horus falcon, he was making a revolutionary statement. He was saying that the Horus kingship model was wrong, that Set, not Horus, should be the patron of the king, that chaos, not order, was the true power. Or perhaps he was saying something even more radical, that the division between Horus and Set was artificial, that both forces were necessary and legitimate. We can only speculate about what prompted this extraordinary move. Was Peripson from a rival royal family that worshipped Set? Was there a civil war between Upper and Lower Egypt, with Peripson representing Set-worshipping southern factions against Horus-worshipping northerners? Was there a religious reformation, a genuine theological dispute about the nature of kingship and divine power? Or, following our Anunnaki hypothesis, was there a dispute about bloodlines? If the first pharaohs really were descended from divine beings, from the Anunnaki or their equivalent, then perhaps Peripson represented a different bloodline, a different branch of the divine family tree. In Mesopotamian mythology, remember, the Anunnaki were not unified. They had factions. Enlil was stern, demanding, quick to judge humanity harshly, the commander, the enforcer. Enki was clever, sympathetic to humans, always finding ways to circumvent his brother's harsher decrees. The scientist, the rebel. Could Horus and Set represent Egyptian interpretations of the same factional split? Could the choice of which god to align with represent not just theology, but actual genetic heritage, different branches of hybrid bloodlines competing for supremacy? Think about it. If the Anunnaki really did create multiple royal bloodlines across different regions, using different genetic templates, optimizing for different traits, then conflicts between these bloodlines would be inevitable. One bloodline might carry more Enlil characteristics, order, discipline, strict hierarchy. Another might carry more Enki characteristics, innovation, flexibility, sympathy for humanity. The Horus/Set conflict might not be mythology at all, but a garbled historical record of an actual genetic and political war between two Anunnaki-descended royal houses. The crisis was eventually resolved by the last king of the Second Dynasty, Kheskemwy, whose name means the two powers arise, or the appearance of the two powers. His Serek is unique and telling. It shows both Horus and Set, the falcon and the Set animal together. Kheskemwy didn't choose between them. He incorporated both. His message was clear. The two powers, Horus and Set, order and chaos, could coexist. They must coexist. Egypt needed both. This resolution is fascinating because it suggests a sophisticated understanding of cosmic balance. The Egyptians developed a concept called Ma'at, often translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, but Ma'at was more nuanced than simple order. It was the right balance between opposing forces. Ma'at existed in tension with Isfit, chaos or disorder, and the job of the pharaoh was not to eliminate chaos, but to maintain the proper balance. Too much order led to stagnation. Too much chaos led to destruction. The wise king maintained equilibrium. Kheskemwy's reconciliation of Horus and Set, his insistence that both powers were necessary, was a profound theological statement. And it worked. After Kheskemwy, the Third Dynasty began, and with it the Old Kingdom, Egypt's Golden Age. The pyramids were built. Art and architecture flourished. Divine kingship was firmly re-established, with the Horus name restored to its primary position. But Set was not eliminated. He remained in the pantheon, his force recognized as necessary, if dangerous. This entire episode reveals that the system of divine kingship in Egypt was more complex and more contested than we sometimes imagine. It wasn't simply handed down from on high and accepted without question. There were disputes, crises, moments when the entire structure nearly collapsed. And yet it was restored, repeatedly, for 3,000 years. This kind of institutional stability is extraordinary. It suggests either that the Egyptians genuinely believed with absolute conviction that their kings were divine, or there was something real underlying the claim. Some actual difference, some measurable quality that made the royal bloodlines distinct from common Egyptians. If we follow the Anunnaki hypothesis, the Second Dynasty crisis makes perfect sense. It represents a moment when different bloodlines, different descendants of the gods, competed for dominance. Peripsen represented one line, perhaps more closely tied to whatever force or entity stood behind Set. Keskemwi represented another, or perhaps he was a genuine hybrid carrying both bloodlines, thus able to unite the factions. This is speculation, of course, but it's speculation grounded in a real historical crisis that mainstream Egyptology struggles to fully explain. Why would a pharaoh suddenly align himself with Set, the enemy of legitimate kingship? Why would this alignment nearly tear Egypt apart? And why, after this crisis, did the concept of divine kingship emerge stronger than ever? The answers might lie not just in politics or theology, but in genetics, in bloodlines, in the reality that the first pharaohs really were different, really did carry something that set them apart from ordinary humans. And that this difference was worth fighting over, worth killing for, worth restructuring an entire kingdom to preserve. But what was this difference? What made royal blood actually different? To answer that, we need to look at the genetic evidence. And what we find there is disturbing. One of the most powerful tools of modern archaeology is ancient DNA analysis. We can now extract genetic material from mummies, from bones, from teeth, and map the ancestry of people who lived thousands of years ago. And when scientists began analyzing DNA from ancient Egyptians, particularly from the period of the first pharaohs, they found something unexpected. Something that directly connects Egypt to Mesopotamia at exactly the time when divine kingship was being established. Recent studies of ancient Egyptian DNA, including DNA extracted from mummies dating to the First Dynasty, have revealed a pattern that challenges the standard narrative. Modern Egyptians show strong genetic connections to populations from sub-Saharan Africa, which makes perfect sense given Egypt's location. Egypt is, after all, in Africa, but ancient Egyptians from the time of the first pharaohs show significant genetic markers linking them to populations from the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia, from the Fertile Crescent, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. A 2017 study published in Nature Communications analyzed DNA from mummies spanning 1,300 years of Egyptian history. The researchers found that ancient Egyptians, particularly those from the earlier periods, had much less sub-Saharan African ancestry than modern Egyptians. Instead, they showed strong genetic links to ancient populations from the Levant and Mesopotamia. More specifically, a 2015 study analyzing DNA from a man buried near Abydos around 3000 BCE, roughly contemporary with Narmer himself, found that while the majority of his genome showed African and North African ancestry, approximately 20% showed clear genetic links to populations from Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. Now, geneticists will tell you this isn't proof of anything extraordinary. Gene flow between regions is normal. Trade brings people. People marry. Genetics spread. But the timing is striking. Right around the moment when Mesopotamian cultural influence floods into Egypt, divine kingship appears fully formed. The Narmer Palette shows Mesopotamian artistic motifs. We also see significant Mesopotamian genetic markers in the Egyptian population, particularly, presumably, in the elite populations who were buried with elaborate grave goods and who could afford imported Mesopotamian luxury items. Were the first pharaohs or their ancestors from Mesopotamia? Were they part of a migration, perhaps a ruling elite that brought not just goods and ideas, but a complete system of government from the East? Or, following the Anunnaki hypothesis, were they hybrids, descendants of the same Anunnaki bloodlines that ruled in Sumer, establishing a parallel dynasty in Egypt? The texts themselves hint at something unusual about royal bloodlines. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were described as taking human wives, creating hybrid offspring who served as intermediaries between the gods and humanity. These hybrids were called various names in different periods, sometimes demigods, sometimes kings, sometimes heroes. The Sumerian king list describes early rulers with impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, numbers that make no sense if we're talking about human lifespans but make perfect sense if we're talking about something else. Beings whose existence spanned vast periods of time incomprehensible to mortal minds. After the Great Flood, the king list records dramatically shorter reigns, 1,200 years, then 900 years, then gradually down to numbers that approach normal human lifespans. As if after the flood, direct rule by the Anunnaki ended, and their hybrid offspring, part divine, part human, took over. Each generation becoming slightly more human, slightly less godlike, until we reach historical kings whose reigns we can actually verify. Does this same pattern appear in Egypt? Remarkably, yes. The Turin Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian king list from the New Kingdom, doesn't begin with Narmer or Menes. It begins with the gods. First, Ra the sun god rules Egypt for thousands of years. Then other deities take turns governing the two lands, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus. After the gods come the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who bridge the gap between the age of gods and the age of men. Only after this long divine prehistory do we finally arrive at Menes/Narmer, the first human pharaoh. Except he's not really human, is he? Because he's still Horus incarnate. The theological genealogy is clear. The pharaohs of Egypt are the direct descendants, the chosen successors of beings who ruled before history began. In Egypt, this is treated as religious mythology, beautiful, complex, politically useful mythology, but just mythology. In Mesopotamia, thanks to Sitchin and the ancient astronaut theorists, it's treated as garbled history, an account of real events involving real non-human entities. But what if both civilizations were recording the same truth? What if the gods of Egypt and the Anunnaki of Sumer were the same beings, operating in both regions, establishing parallel systems of divine kingship with human, or partially human, rulers as their representatives on Earth? Here's where the genetic evidence becomes even more intriguing. Royal marriages in Egypt were famously incestuous, with pharaohs often marrying their sisters or half-sisters to keep the bloodline pure. Mainstream Egyptology explains this as a way to concentrate power and wealth within the royal family, to prevent dilution of the dynasty. But if we take the texts at face value, if we believe that the pharaohs really did carry something different in their blood, then the incestuous marriages make perfect sense from a genetic perspective. If the royal bloodline carried specific genes from the Anunnaki, genetic modifications, enhancements, perhaps even non-terrestrial DNA, then mixing with common Egyptians would dilute those genes with each generation. The only way to preserve the divine spark, the genetic heritage that made pharaohs actually different from normal humans, was to breed within the bloodline itself. It's worth noting that in ancient texts describing the Anunnaki, great emphasis is placed on bloodlines, on maintaining the purity of genetic heritage, on ensuring that the divine traits passed from one generation to the next without being diluted by too much mixing with ordinary humans. The Anunnaki themselves, according to Sitchin's interpretation, practiced what we might call genetic caste systems, carefully tracking lineages, arranging strategic marriages, ensuring that positions of power went to those with the highest percentage of Anunnaki DNA. Could the Egyptian practice of royal incest be a continuation of the same system? A way of maintaining whatever genetic modifications or enhancements the Anunnaki had introduced into the first pharaonic bloodlines. We're in deeply speculative territory here, but we're also pattern matching against real evidence. Real genetic markers showing Mesopotamian ancestry in early Egyptian elites, real cultural exchange between Mesopotamia and Egypt at the critical moment, real textual evidence from both civilizations describing divine ancestry, and the importance of maintaining pure bloodlines, real archaeological evidence of sudden, sophisticated civilization appearing almost overnight. None of this proves ancient aliens genetically engineered the pharaohs. But it does suggest that something more complex than the standard narrative was happening at the dawn of Egyptian civilization. And there's one more piece of evidence we need to examine: the knowledge, the sophisticated mathematical, astronomical, and architectural knowledge that appears in Egypt seemingly out of nowhere. Knowledge that both civilizations attributed to gifts from the gods. Let's talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza. Built during the 4th dynasty around 2560 BCE for the pharaoh Khufu, it stands as one of the most precisely constructed buildings ever created, even by modern standards. Consider these facts. Its base is almost perfectly level, with variations of less than an inch across its 756-foot length. It was originally aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a degree. The ratio of its height to the perimeter of its base is almost exactly equivalent to the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. Encoding the value of pi, the pyramid's orientation correlates with the Orion constellation. Its internal passages align with celestial bodies. The Egyptians supposedly built this using copper tools and stone hammers. No wheel for transport, no iron, no modern surveying equipment, no computers, no lasers, no GPS. They quarried, transported, and precisely placed over 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing more than 70 tons, in what may have been as little as 20 years. How? Mainstream Egyptology has developed plausible explanations involving ramps, levers, copper saws, sledges, and an enormous, highly organized workforce of skilled craftsmen working with incredible precision. These explanations work. They don't require anything supernatural or extraterrestrial, but they do require something remarkable. They require that the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty possessed sophisticated knowledge of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, engineering, knowledge that appears in the archaeological record to emerge almost overnight. The mathematics required to design and build the pyramids includes understanding of fractions and ratios, volume calculations, trigonometry. The value of pi is almost equal to 3.14159. The golden ratio, phi, is almost equal to 1.618. The astronomy required to align the pyramids with such precision means the Egyptians must have been observing and mapping the stars with incredible accuracy. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis causing star positions to shift over thousands of years, how to use star sightings for orientation, particularly Sirius and the circumpolar star, solar and lunar cycles, the relationship between time, space, and celestial movements. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is that it developed gradually over centuries, that the Egyptians learned through trial and error, that earlier, simpler structures taught them the principles they later perfected in the pyramids. This is probably true, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the earliest pyramids, like the step pyramid of Djoser built just before the Great Pyramid, are so dramatically different in design and construction technique. It doesn't explain the technological regression we see in later periods, when Egyptian construction techniques actually became less precise, as if they'd lost knowledge their ancestors possessed. And it doesn't explain the persistent Egyptian tradition, recorded in multiple texts, that their knowledge was a gift from the gods, that Thoth, god of wisdom, taught them writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, that their civilization was not built from scratch but was a restoration, a rebuilding of an order that existed in a previous age when gods walked the earth. This brings us back to Mesopotamia and the Anunnaki, because the Sumerians said exactly the same thing. They credited their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, law, and agriculture to the Anunnaki and to the Apkallu, semi-divine sages who came before the Great Flood. They described their civilization not as something they invented, but as something they were taught. When we compare Sumerian and Egyptian mathematics, we find remarkable parallels. Both used sexagesimal systems based on divisions of 60, which we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes or circles into 360 degrees. Both had sophisticated understanding of fractions and could perform complex volume calculations. Both observed the stars with incredible precision and used their observations to create calendars that tracked both lunar and solar cycles. If both civilizations were developing this knowledge independently, the similarities make sense up to a point. Humans solving the same problems tend to arrive at similar solutions. But the degree of similarity, combined with the documented cultural exchange during the critical period when Egypt was unifying, suggests something more direct. A transmission of knowledge, a teaching, a download. This is where the Anunnaki hypothesis becomes genuinely compelling to many people. Not because we can prove ancient aliens flew to Earth in spaceships, we cannot, but because the pattern of advanced knowledge appearing suddenly, being attributed to divine teachers, and then being maintained with great precision for thousands of years before gradually degrading fits a specific model. The model of a civilization that received a boost, a foundation, a starting template from an outside source. Whether that source was extraterrestrial Anunnaki from Nibiru, lost advanced human civilization from before the flood, like Atlantis, survivors of some global cataclysm who preserved ancient knowledge-time travelers from our own future, or something else entirely, remains an open question. What is not an open question is that both the Sumerians and the Egyptians themselves believed their knowledge came from the gods. They said it explicitly, repeatedly. They organized their entire societies around the principle that divine beings had chosen certain bloodlines to rule, to serve as intermediaries between the celestial and terrestrial realms. The first pharaohs of Egypt claimed to be Horus incarnate. They claimed divine descent. They claimed their right to rule came not from conquest or election, but from their very nature as beings who bridged the gap between gods and men. If we take them at their word, if we believe that they believe this, then we must ask, what made them think they were different? What gave them the audacity to make such claims? Was it purely political theater, a useful fiction to consolidate power? Perhaps. But perhaps there was something more. Perhaps they knew something about their ancestry, their bloodline, their very DNA that set them apart. Perhaps they really were the descendants of those who came from the sky, the Anunnaki by another name, Horus as another face of the same divine power that the Sumerians called Enki or Enlil. Let me show you one final piece of evidence that ties this all together, the comparative mythology that suggests Egypt and Mesopotamia weren't just sharing ideas, but were recording the same events from different cultural perspectives. When we compare the mythologies of Sumer and Egypt side by side, something remarkable emerges. The same gods appear in both cultures, but under different names. Consider Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, water, and creation. Enki is the creator of humanity through genetic manipulation, the wise serpent who defied Enlil to save humanity from the flood, the patron of cities and civilizations, the teacher of arts and sciences, the trickster who outsmarts rivals through intelligence rather than force associated with water, particularly fresh water, the Abzu. Now consider Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom. Thoth is depicted as an ibis-headed man, a water bird, connecting him to Enki's association with water, the god of wisdom, writing, magic, and science, the one who taught humans how to write, calculate, and organize societies, the mediator between gods, using cleverness rather than brute force associated with the moon and with timekeeping. The parallels are striking. Both Enki and Thoth are associated with wisdom and writing, credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization, somewhat liminal figures, neither fully aligned with ruling authority nor in rebellion against it, intermediaries who bridge the divine and human worlds. Are Enki and Thoth the same entity? Different cultural interpretations of the same being who operated in both Mesopotamia and Egypt? This is pure speculation, but it's the kind of pattern that makes researchers wonder. Consider another parallel. In Sumerian mythology, there was a great flood that nearly destroyed humanity. The god Enki warned a man named Ziusadra, called Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions, to build a great boat to survive the coming deluge. Enki instructed Ziusadra to bring his family and the seed of all living things aboard this vessel. The flood came, lasted for days, destroyed all life on earth except what was in the boat. When the waters receded, Ziusadra made sacrifice to the gods. And Enlil, initially angry that anyone had survived, granted Ziusadra and his wife immortality and placed them to dwell at the mouth of the rivers. Egyptian mythology has no exactly parallel flood story in the classical sense, but it has something interesting. The Egyptians described a time called Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods ruled Egypt directly. This was a golden age, a perfect time before decay and death entered the world. Then came a catastrophic event, sometimes described as a rebellion, sometimes as the gods' withdrawal from direct rule. After this crisis, the gods appointed human or semi-divine kings to rule in their stead. The pharaohs represented the restoration of divine order after a time of chaos. The Egyptians also had detailed knowledge of a precessional cycle, a 26,000-year period that some researchers have interpreted as marking a great year, a cosmic cycle of creation and destruction. The Sphinx at Giza may have astronomical alignments suggesting it was built much earlier than traditionally dated, perhaps during a previous age. Some alternative researchers, most notably Robert Schoch and John Anthony West, have argued that the Sphinx shows evidence of water erosion, which would require significant rainfall, something Egypt hasn't experienced since before 10,000 BCE, long before Egyptian civilization supposedly began. These alternative theories are highly controversial and rejected by most Egyptologists, but they point to a persistent feeling that something is missing from our understanding of Egypt's origins. That there was a previous age, a time before history when things were different. Both Sumerian and Egyptian texts describe this antediluvian period when the gods walked the earth. Both describe a catastrophe that ended that age. And both describe the period after the catastrophe as a time when divine knowledge was preserved and passed down through carefully chosen human representatives. The royal bloodlines, the god kings. The Anunnaki timeline. Putting it all together. If we follow the Anunnaki hypothesis to its logical conclusion, here is the timeline that emerges. For 50,000 years ago, according to Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki arrive on Earth from their planet Nibiru. They establish bases in Mesopotamia. They begin mining operations for gold. They create Homo sapiens as a hybrid workforce through genetic engineering. 300,000-200,000 years ago, human civilization develops slowly under Anunnaki guidance. Multiple experiments, multiple iterations. Some humans, those with the highest percentage of Anunnaki DNA, are elevated to positions of authority. 13,000 years ago, approximately 11,000 BCE, catastrophe strikes. Whether from Nibiru's return causing gravitational disruptions, a comet strike, or massive climate change, the Younger Dryas period begins. A sudden return to Ice Age conditions lasting over 1,000 years, massive flooding as glaciers melt, destruction of whatever advanced civilizations existed at that time. The geological record confirms this catastrophic period. 10,000-4,000 BCE. Climate stabilizes after the floods. The Anunnaki, or their hybrid descendants, emerge from whatever refuges they'd prepared. They begin the process of rebuilding civilization. 4,000-3,000 BCE. Mesopotamia. Sumerian city-states are established. The Anunnaki teach survivors agriculture, writing, mathematics. Astronomy. Kingship is established as a divine institution. Royal bloodlines are created. Hybrids who carry Anunnaki genetics. Religion is developed as a means of maintaining contact with and control over human populations. 3,100 BCE. Egypt. The same process is repeated in Egypt. Either the Anunnaki themselves, or their hybrid descendants, or perhaps Mesopotamian humans educated in the Anunnaki system travel to Egypt. They find indigenous populations along the Nile skilled in agriculture but politically fragmented. They introduce/impose the concept of divine kingship. They select or breed a royal bloodline, Narmer/Menes, perhaps mixing Mesopotamian genetic heritage with Egyptian. These pharaohs, carrying genetic and cultural heritage from both East and indigenous populations, unify Egypt. The dynastic system is established and will last 3,000 years. This hypothesis is comprehensive. It explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in both civilizations, why both Sumerians and Egyptians credited their advances to divine teachers, the cultural and genetic connections between Mesopotamia and Egypt during the critical period of Egyptian unification, divine kingship as a real biological reality. The pharaohs really were different, really did carry the blood of the gods, Anunnaki genetics. Why royal bloodlines were so carefully guarded through incestuous marriage. Why the pharaohs could claim to be gods incarnate, because they were hybrid beings with non-human ancestry. Why Horus was not a metaphor but a bloodline, perhaps even a consciousness or pattern transmitted through DNA. This is, of course, deeply speculative. It requires accepting premises that mainstream science rejects. It requires believing that ancient texts describing gods teaching humanity should be read literally rather than metaphorically. But here's the thing. Even if we reject the extraterrestrial hypothesis entirely, even if we insist that the Anunnaki were just the gods of Mesopotamian mythology and nothing more, we are still left with genuine mysteries. We are still left with the question of why divine kingship appeared so suddenly and completely in Egypt. We are still left with the cultural and genetic connections between Mesopotamia and Egypt. We are still left with the fact that both civilizations attributed their knowledge to divine teachers and organized their societies around the idea that certain bloodlines carried the right to rule because of their divine descent. These mysteries don't disappear just because we reject ancient astronauts. They demand explanation. As we conclude this investigation, let us return to where we began, standing at the edge of the Nile, watching the coronation of the first pharaoh. We see Narmer, a man or something more than a man, taking the double crown. We see the priests performing rituals older than memory. We see the falcon Horus hovering above the king's head. And we have to ask ourselves, what were they really doing? What were they really believing? Were they creating a useful political fiction that would help them govern a fractious kingdom? Or were they recognizing something true about this man, about his bloodline, about his connection to powers that came from elsewhere? The Anunnaki, whether we understand them as extraterrestrials from Nibiru advanced humans from a lost pre-flood civilization archaic deities who once walked the earth or nothing more than mythological creations of ancient minds, haunt the origins of human civilization. They are there in the Sumerian texts described in concrete, specific terms. They are present in the sudden flowering of Egyptian civilization, in the insistence on divine kingship, in the genetic and cultural connections that tie the Nile to Mesopotamia. We may never know for certain if the first pharaohs were chosen by the Anunnaki. We may never have definitive proof that divine kingship was more than an inspired political innovation. But we can look at the evidence with open minds. We can read the ancient texts, both Sumerian and Egyptian, with respect for what they're actually saying, rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. We can follow the trail of cultural exchange, genetic markers, astronomical knowledge, architectural sophistication that connects these two great civilizations. And we can allow ourselves to wonder, to ask the questions that make academics uncomfortable, to imagine possibilities that mainstream science refuses to consider. Because the truth, whatever it is almost certainly stranger than the sanitized version we learned in school. The first pharaohs of Egypt were not just kings. They were something more. God kings, Horus incarnate, descendants of beings who came from the sky. Whether that's metaphor or memory, whether that's religion or history, whether that's mythology or genetics, remains the enduring mystery at the heart of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The falcon still hovers above the throne, watching, waiting, reminding us that there are things about our past we have forgotten, things about our origins that remain hidden, things about the gods, the Anunnaki, the divine bloodlines that once ruled the world, that we are only just beginning to remember. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me. These are uncomfortable questions. They challenge what we think we know about history. They suggest possibilities that seem impossible. But history is full of impossibilities that turned out to be true. New discoveries are made every year that force us to revise our understanding of the ancient world. Perhaps someday we'll have definitive answers about the first pharaohs and their connection to the mysterious Anunnaki. Until then, we continue to search, to question, to explore the shadows where history and myth merge into something we cannot yet fully comprehend. The falcon watches, the gods remember, and humanity, descendants of whatever came before, continues to build its monuments, tell its stories, and wonder about the stars from which we might, just might, have descended. If you enjoyed this exploration, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into ancient mysteries. Let me know in the comments, were the first pharaohs chosen by the Anunnaki? Is divine kingship a political invention or a historical reality? Are we the descendants of something more than earthly evolution? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're interested in more content like this, check out our other videos exploring the mysteries of the ancient world, the real history they don't teach in schools. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop looking for the truth hidden in the shadows of history. The gods are watching, and they remember everything.